The 11th objection that the atheist website, God is Imaginary, the 11th argument made against the existence of God is one that we, again, have already seen. There's a lot of repetition in these arguments. At first glance, it looks like, 50 arguments. That's a lot. But after looking at some of these and looking ahead at them, I see that there are several points that are repeated over and again. And this one is one of those. This one is entitled, "There is no scientific evidence." And the idea here is that there's no scientific evidence for the existence of God, and therefore God doesn't exist, or that God is imaginary. The assumption, of course, here is that the only evidence that counts is scientific evidence, that any other sort of evidence is not allowable. I would say several things in response to this. First of all, that I would argue, and I will argue, I'm sure, numerous times before I finish these 50 points, that the very existence of a physical world is reason to believe in God. In other words, the very existence, the very reality of a physical world that we can scientifically study, I would argue presupposes the existence of a self-existent eternal power that can produce a world like this one. One might want to argue that this world is eternal, but I think the evidence points quite to the contrary. Scientific evidence, I think, points us to questions that reach beyond science. There are some questions that they transcend science in the sense of the scientific method, and that's a very important question. The scientific method, or topic here, the scientific method is a method developed to study certain aspects of the physical world. There are some things that lie beyond the study of science. And let me give you several examples, because I think this is a very, very important topic. First of all, science itself presupposes things that cannot be demonstrated scientifically. For instance, one of the most obvious ones is that science assumes the existence of a world outside of ourselves, a world that can be known, a world that can be subject to a scientific analysis really exists. Now, there have been plenty of people down through the centuries, and people ask the same question today. How do I know that the world around me is not just a projection of my mind? It's not just a vivid dream state. René Descartes, one of the philosophers who took that approach, now of course he believed he could get beyond it, but only by, in his particular philosophical approach, only by showing that God exists could he reconnect himself with the sensory world. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that line of argument. All I'm saying is that when we experience the world and we apply the scientific method to it, we are assuming its reality as an independent thing from ourselves, that it is an objective reality that we can know and that has independent existence apart from our minds. And that is not something that can be demonstrated scientifically. There have been plenty of idealist philosophers down through the centuries who presented very sophisticated systems of philosophy based on the idea that the world is really mind and not matter and not physical at all. So the assumption that the world is physical is a non-demonstrable scientific assumption, not something that can be proven through science. Another assumption of science is that our senses are reliable, that our senses are giving to us true information about the world. There have been plenty of philosophers who have argued that our senses are tainted in some way and that they distort the reality we're experiencing. To give you one great example, Stephen Hawking, a famous contemporary scientist, in his book The Grand Design, he presents the image of a fish in a fish bowl. The fish bowl will distort the light that comes into it so that the fish will, if it grows up or spends its whole life in a fish bowl, will have a distorted picture of what exists outside of the fish bowl. And Stephen Hawking makes the argument that we can never know through some type of independent verification whether or not our senses and our experience of this world is not a distorted perception of reality. Again, I don't agree with the conclusions of his argument, but he's admitting from a scientific standpoint that there are certain assumptions that we make that we cannot get outside of the whole system of nature and verify them because we find ourselves within the system of nature. Another assumption that is made by science is that the material world around us is regular and predictable and orderly. That tomorrow will be like today, that the speed of light will be a constant tomorrow and next year and 1,000 years from now and 1,000,000 years from now. And we make all these assumptions based on the regularity and the orderliness of nature. How can I prove that? Can I prove that tomorrow the speed of light won't change, or that the nature of atoms or quantum behavior or whatever is not going to be the same, or that it will be different? I can't prove that. We assume that. It's an assumption of science, and we go on based on those assumptions and make certain conclusions. Another assumption of science, and we could go on for quite some time with this, but let me give you one more. Another assumption of science is that our powers of deductive and inductive thought or rationality are sound. That we draw conclusions. For example, science is very heavily based on inductive reasoning, that we gather up different bits of data and we draw certain general conclusions based on that data. Or we use deduction frequently. We come to know what something is, we think, or the nature of it, and then we draw certain inferences from that. We know something about, or we develop a theory of gravity, and then we make predictions based on that. All of that is based on a certain confidence in logic, or the structures of logic, all of which have to be used in order to think scientifically. You don't prove them before you do science, or you don't prove them by the scientific method. You have to use it in order to even engage in science. And the same is true with all these other things. You have to trust the senses in order to even get into science. You have to trust the powers of logical thought in order to even do science. So all of these are sort of trans-scientific or pre-scientific assumptions. And the atheist, it seems to me, is largely oblivious to this fact, because if the atheist were aware of this, he would also discover that the existence of God as the supreme ground of logic, of reason, of truth, is also, I think, one of those pre-scientific or trans-scientific realities. Now, there are things about the world, the sensory world, the physical world, that point us to a cause, a reason, a ground for its very being, its very existence, for its orderliness, for our ability to know it. And so the existence of God, I would argue, is one of those trans-scientific or meta-scientific questions that, among many other things, the scientist, I think, is quite in his range of acceptable practices to accept those things as presuppositions of the scientific method. So yeah, God is not an object of the physical sciences in the sense of observing the behavior of animals in the wild as an object of scientific, zoology or whatever, or the behavior of chemicals under certain circumstances or combinations. Obviously, God's not like that, because God is the ground of all those things, the source of all of those things, and so God is not subject to the same type of scientific analysis as all of these other things. Now, one other very quick point, and I'm taking a little bit longer than I expected on that, but one other quick point that I want to make is I was in a conversation here recently with an atheist friend of mine, and we were having a conversation. He was telling me about how he's going to teach at a school which is very similar to the one that he grew up going to when he was in high school. At that school, he said it was a pretty rough school, and the kids, came from the, sort of the rough side of town, and they had rough family situations, usually very high poverty rate in his school. And now he's going, after teaching for some years in another type of environment, he's going to teach in this a school like that, like the one that he grew up in. And he was telling me how he felt that this was almost like his purpose in life, that's where he should be. That's almost like his calling in life, is to go back and help those kids and be a part of helping them to grow out of those pains of their childhood or their poverty or whatever. As I listened to my atheist friend talk, I thought, this just seems like a living contradiction to me. I've had conversations with him before in which he defended an approach to the world that is purely materialistic, that the world is nothing but matter in motion, the world is nothing but atoms bouncing about, or material, quantifiable things, and that nothing else really matters. I remember asking him questions about, what about morality? What about love? And he would say, oh, those things are just illusions. But here he is talking to me and telling me about almost like a call in his life, that I should go here and do this. I felt like I really wasn't doing what I'm supposed to do in life. How can you speak about what you're supposed to do, what you should do, in purely scientific terms? What scientific test can tell us what we should do with our lives? These are moral questions. These are spiritual questions. And the science, the person who takes the approach of scientism, that science is the method that tells us everything that is true and nothing else matters, I think leaves us with a very impoverished, a very cold, and a very shallow world that doesn't really explain the depths of human experience. So the whole idea that there needs to be scientific evidence for the existence of God, I think fails on a number of accounts that I've suggested here.